She had already been gone 3 minutes when James Hargrove realized he hadn't called security. He was standing at the floor-to-ceiling window of his office on the 31st floor, watching the loading dock below through the glass and the rain. The dock lights were still on. They stayed on until midnight, and in their yellow wash, he could see the delivery bays, the stacked pallets, the long concrete apron still wet from the afternoon storm. He could see the gap where she had stood not 30 minutes ago, in her gray work coat and her rubber-soled shoes, with a flat cardboard box folded under each arm. He had watched her walk out through the service gate. He had watched the gate swing shut behind her. He had not moved. He had not called anyone. 30 years of building this company. 30 years of supply chain discipline, of inventory integrity, of knowing to the unit what came in and what went out. His late wife, Eleanor, used to say he could smell a discrepancy from the 4th floor. She had meant it as a compliment. He stood at the window now and told himself this was a simple matter. An employee had been removing company property from the premises without authorization. The warehouse logs had flagged the pattern 6 weeks ago. Mitchell, the floor manager, had come to him with the printouts, the dates, the shift times, the exit footage, and had laid them on this very desk with the quiet confidence of a man delivering a verdict. It all matched. It always matched. The discrepancy appeared every week on the days Clara Whitfield was scheduled to work the evening shift. He had intended to handle it then. He had intended to handle it a dozen times since. But something had stopped him each time. Some small resistance he hadn't been able to name. And now, she had done it again, and he was standing here watching the empty dock. And still, he had not called anyone. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. He told himself he only wanted to understand. The Hargrove Group occupied the top 14 floors of the building his father had put up in 1978, when this part of the city still had manufacturing yards and river freight and men who worked with their hands. His father was gone. The manufacturing yards were gone. What remained was the building, glass and steel, all right angles and clean light, and the company James had spent his life making worthy of it. 600 employees. A supply and distribution network that reached across 3 countries. A reputation he had protected like something living. Eleanor had been the one who said the reputation was the least important thing about it. She said the thing worth protecting was the fact that people here were treated fairly. She had meant it. She had walked the warehouse floor twice a year herself, shaking hands and learning names. She had started the hardship fund. She had pushed for the flexible shift arrangements that the union had never needed to negotiate because she'd put them in place before anyone asked. Eleanor had been gone for 7 months now. A stroke. 53 years old, no warning. There and then, not there. He had returned to the office 3 weeks after the funeral because there was nothing else to do. His son was grown and living in another city. The house was very quiet. The office at least had problems he knew how to solve. He had not walked the warehouse floor since she died. Mitchell had come to him in December with the first printout. James had looked at it and felt nothing in particular, which was itself strange. He had fired people for far less in other years. But he'd told Mitchell to document it further and come back when the pattern was conclusive. Mitchell had come back twice since then. Each time the documentation was more thorough. Each time James had said the same thing. More time. More documentation. He understood now, stepping into the elevator, that he had been avoiding something. He had simply not known what. It took him 11 minutes to reach the service level, sign out through the dock gate, and find his car in the executive bay. Another 4 minutes to navigate the one-way system to the street that ran along the south side of the building. By then she was 2 blocks ahead, walking at a steady pace, the boxes still under her arm. She hadn't gone to the bus stop. She was on foot. He let the car slow to a crawl and kept 2 vehicle lengths between them. The rain had thinned to a drizzle. The streetlights made shallow orange pools on the pavement, and the wet road threw them back doubled. He kept his headlights on low and followed. She crossed Meridian Street at the lights and headed east. He hadn't been east of Meridian at street level in years. From up on the 31st floor, the whole city looked like a plan, organized, proportioned, sensible. You could not see, from up there, the way the plan broke down at its edges. You could not see the details that the altitude erased. Down here, east of Meridian, the proportions changed. The buildings got shorter. The gaps between them got wider. The glass and the clean lines fell away, and what replaced them was older and more tired. Brick warehouses converted, and then abandoned half-converted. Corner shops with hand-painted signs. Stretches of fence with the chain link gone in sections and never replaced. A chicken place still open. Its light very bright and very yellow. 3 people inside. A laundromat with 1 machine running. The drum turning in the window like something patient. A man standing in a doorway in a coat too thin for the night air, watching the street with the practiced stillness of someone who has spent a great deal of time watching streets and expecting nothing from them. James's car moved through all of it. His car was 3 years old, dark blue, the kind of car that was quiet when it moved, that said money without shouting about it. It was the wrong car for this street. He could feel that. A vague friction between what surrounded him and what he was inside. He had felt it once before, long ago, when he had gone with Eleanor to a neighborhood very much like this one. She had been delivering something for one of her charitable committees, and he had felt useless and conspicuous, and she had moved through the streets as if she lived there, shaking hands, knowing names, laughing at something the woman at the door said. He had stood on the pavement and watched and thought, "She is a better person than I will ever be." He had felt proud of that and ashamed of himself in roughly equal measure, which was, he now understood, about the right proportion. He had grown up 4 miles north of here. He had been very conscious when he was young that 4 miles was a different world. He had worked with great deliberation to put the difference behind him. He understood now that the deliberateness was the problem, that you could not put something genuinely behind you by not looking at it. You could only hold it at a distance for as long as your concentration held. And then something. Rain. A dark street. A woman carrying cardboard boxes in the yellow light of a dock would reach through and bring it all back. She turned right at a cross street, where the pavement ended without transition and became packed dirt. His car moved over the change in surface, and he felt it in his hands on the wheel. The road here was narrow. Parked cars on both sides left barely enough room for a single lane, and more than one of them had been there long enough that the grass had grown up through the wheel arches. The streetlights were spaced too far apart to do much good. Between them, the darkness was actual darkness. The kind you don't find in the center of the city. The kind that sits in its own depth and has weight to it. She turned left. She turned left again. She seemed to know exactly where she was going, which of course she did. She had been coming here, he now understood, for weeks. Maybe longer. He turned where she turned, keeping his distance. And then she stopped. He pulled the car to the curb and cut the engine. The house she had stopped in front of was 3 stories of Victorian terrace, or had been once. The upper 2 stories had the closed-down look of rooms that hadn't been entered in years. Windows filmed over with the particular opacity of glass that has been very cold for a very long time. Paint stripped from the sills in long curling sheets. But the ground floor was different. There was light in the ground floor, a warm, specific domestic light, the kind that comes from a lamp placed for a room rather than from an overhead fixture. Someone had put a curtain up, a real curtain dark fabric with a pale pattern. It was imperfectly hung, one end a few inches lower than the other, but it was there. She had stopped at the door. She put one hand on the door, and he watched her take a breath. The kind of breath you take before you leave one version of yourself outside and step into another. Then she put a key in the new lock. He could see it was a new lock, brass still bright, standing out against the weathered paint like something recently believed in, and she went inside. He waited 3 minutes, watching the curtained window. Then he got out of the car. He didn't go to the door. He didn't know, even as he moved toward the building, exactly what he intended. He kept to the near edge of the pavement, out of the pool of light from the ground floor window. The building had a narrow side passage, barely wide enough to pass through, and without deciding to, he was in it, moving quietly. The passage smelled of damp brick and old wood. Halfway along, one of the boards over a side window had come loose at the bottom, and there was a gap, 4, maybe 5 inches, between the board and the rotting sill. He stopped. He stood with his back against the wet brick and listened. He heard her voice first, not the voice he knew from the warehouse floor, not the careful, controlled voice that said, "Good evening, Mr. Hargrove," or "Yes, sir, I'll have that done," but a different voice, lower and warmer and unhurried. The kind of voice that costs nothing because it isn't performing anything. She was speaking quickly, the way you speak to people who know all your stories and will not judge any of them. He couldn't make out the words, just the tone, just the quality of it, like warm water, like a room in which someone had recently made tea. Then a child's voice, bright and unself-conscious, cutting through with that particular clarity children have before they learn to soften themselves for the world. "Auntie Clara, you're home." He pressed his face to the gap in the board. The room had a bare bulb hanging from the center of the ceiling, but it wasn't on. The light came from a lamp in the corner, the same lamp he'd seen from the street, and from a candle on the windowsill that had been burning long enough to have pooled deep and steady. The floor was uneven, old boards, but they had been swept clean. Against the far wall there were 3 beds, actual beds, or the closest thing to them, made from cardboard and timber and what looked like folded moving blankets. They were solidly built. They were built with attention. On the nearest one sat a child of perhaps 7 years, dark-haired, watching Clara with the complete ease of someone who had never had any reason to be afraid of her. In Clara's arms was a younger child, a girl, maybe 4. The little girl had her face pressed into Clara's neck and her arms locked around her, holding on with the absolute uncomplicated confidence of a child who has done this 1,000 times and expects to do it 1,000 more. Standing near the corner, trying and failing to appear less interested than he was a boy of 9 or 10. He had a book in his hand, but he wasn't looking at it. Clara had set the boxes down by the door. She was still in her gray work coat, still in her rubber-soled shoes, and she was turning slowly in a small circle, the way people turn when a child won't let them put them down. A loose, impractical waltz, the little girl bumping against her shoulder. The two of them moving with a specific, imperfect grace that only happens between people who love each other, without condition. James stood at the gap and looked more carefully at the beds. They had been built with real care. The cardboard was doubled and layered for rigidity, bound at the edges with electrical tape, and the frame of each one had been reinforced with lengths of timber, reclaimed from somewhere, cut to size, sanded smooth at the ends where a child's hand might rest. The moving blankets were folded over twice and tucked. There was a pillowcase on each pillow. They were not matching pillowcases. But they were clean, and they had been pressed. Because Clara Whitfield had decided that her dead sister's children would sleep with pressed pillowcases even if the house around them was condemned, even after a 10-hour shift, even carrying the materials by hand across the city in the drizzle. He looked at the new boxes she had set by the door. He understood now what they were for. Not the first set. Not the last. Carried out over weeks, piece by piece, the company's waste becoming the room's furniture. James Hargrove stood in the cold passage and could not move. The boy in the corner, the oldest, finally put his book down and came forward and said something James couldn't hear. Clara laughed. It was a short sound, real and unguarded. Nothing like anything he had ever heard from her at work. She said something back to the boy, and he turned away, making a show of indifference that didn't convince anyone in the room, and sat back down on his bed. Then the little girl lifted her head from Clara's shoulder and said, into the warm lamplight, in a voice so clear and direct it seemed to have no awareness that it was the most devastatingly important sentence James had ever heard in his 57 years of living on this earth. Auntie Clara built us beds, so we don't have to sleep on the floor anymore. Daddy used to say she was the strongest person in the world. He stepped back from the board. He didn't step back deliberately. His body simply moved backward, the way a body moves when the mind inside it has suffered something it has not yet had the language to process. His shoulder met the wet brick wall of the passage, and he let it take his weight. He stood there. The drizzle had stopped, but the guttering above him was still running, and the water fell past him in a thin, cold stream. He did not move away from it. He thought about the boxes. He thought about 6 weeks of warehouse logs. He thought about Mitchell standing at his desk with the printouts. He thought about the footage, the service gate, the gray coat, the flat cardboard boxes. He thought about what he had assumed. He thought about what the assumption had required him to believe about a woman who had, without telling anyone, without asking for anything, without collecting a shred of credit or acknowledgement, come to a condemned house on a dark street every week and built beds out of cardboard so that her dead sister's children did not have to sleep on the floor. He became aware that his hands were shaking. He looked down at them in the dim light of the passage, and they were shaking the way hands shake not from cold, but from something larger than cold, some internal tremor that has nothing to do with temperature. His car keys were in his right hand. He became aware that he had been gripping them too hard for too long. He opened his hand and the keys fell onto the wet ground, and he did not pick them up. He stood against the brick wall in the dark with the gutter water running past him, and could not straighten. 30 years of never being wrong about a person. Eleanor, he thought. You always knew. You always walked those floors. You knew every name. You knew what people were carrying. He had not walked those floors in 7 months. He had stood behind glass, 31 floors up, and let a man with a printout tell him what to believe. He did not know how long he stood in that passage. Long enough for the gutter to stop running. Long enough for the lamplight behind the curtain to shift, the way lamplight shifts when someone in a room moves to settle a child. When he finally walked back to his car, he moved slowly, like a man carrying something that must not be spilled. He sat in the driver's seat for a very long time without starting the engine. He thought about Mitchell. He thought about the timing of the initial report. December, the month the quarterly audit had flagged a significant discrepancy in the warehouse supply inventory. Not a minor discrepancy, a significant one. He thought about the fact that Mitchell had come to him with a very specific target, a loading dock worker, a woman on the evening shift, someone with neither influence nor advocate, within 1 week of that audit notice. He thought about the fact that Mitchell had continued to push, continued to document, continued to return with more evidence against this particular woman, while the audit itself had somehow lost momentum, had been quietly absorbed into a review process that had not yet reached a conclusion. He thought about the photographs on his desk. The one of Eleanor. The one of their son on his first day at university. He thought about how he had been using those photographs as a permission slip, telling himself his grief made him careful, made him slow to act, made him cautious, when in fact what his grief had made him was distracted. Distracted and therefore available to be managed by the people around him who understood how distracted he was and knew what that was worth to them. He started the car. He was at his desk at 7 the following morning, 2 hours before the main office opened. He called Marcus Webb, the company's head of internal audit, not Mitchell's direct manager, but the person 3 levels above Mitchell. A man who had been with the company since Eleanor's time, and who had, as far as James could determine, never once told him what he wanted to hear rather than what was true. He told Webb to pull the full warehouse inventory records for the past 8 months. He told him to pay particular attention to anything Mitchell had signed off on. He told him to have someone check the service gate exit logs against Mitchell's access record, not Clara's. Then, he called Helen Fay, the head housekeeper, who had been with the company 22 years and who had worked alongside Eleanor on the hardship fund. He asked her what she knew about Clara Whitfield. Helen Fay was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Her sister died in October. Leanne Whitfield. She left 3 young children, no father. He died on a construction site, James, an industrial site out in Crestfield, 18 months before that. Clara took in the children because there was no one else. She's been working double shifts where she can." He asked about the boxes. Helen said, "I've seen her take them. I told Mitchell 6 weeks ago that I knew what they were for. He thanked me and told me he'd log my statement. He did not ask what the boxes were for." James put the phone down and sat very still. Through the window the sky was pale and cold, and the light was coming up over the eastern edge of the city, over the rows of terraced houses, over the streets where the pavement ended and became packed dirt. He wrote 2 names on a piece of paper. He sat with them for a moment. Then he made one more call. By 3 that afternoon, Webb's team had found it. The discrepancy in the warehouse inventory was not coming from the loading dock. It was coming from the procurement approvals. 4 months of inflated order quantities. The excess redirected to a secondary supplier account that had been opened in December and that bore, on its company registration, the name of Mitchell's brother-in-law. Webb brought the file to James's office. He spread it on the desk with no particular drama. He said, "I should have caught this in January. I'm sorry I didn't." James said, "Who else knows about the report against Whitfield?" Webb said, "It was in her file. It was going to be formally actioned this week." Mitchell had booked a meeting with HR for Thursday. James looked at the file for a long time. Then he said, "Cancel the meeting, and I need a room on the ground floor by the end of today." Clara Whitfield arrived for her shift at 4 in the afternoon, the way she always did. She signed in at the desk, collected her equipment, and was halfway across the warehouse floor when James Hargrove came through the main door and walked toward her. Behind him were Webb, Helen Fay, and 3 members of the HR team. Behind them was Mitchell, who had been escorted from his own office 20 minutes earlier, and who was now standing at the edge of the open floor with an expression he couldn't arrange into anything that worked. The warehouse floor was not empty. The evening shift had already begun, and there were 18 people at their stations or moving between them. And each of them, one by one, stopped what they were doing. James stopped 3 feet from Clara Whitfield. She stood straight. She held her equipment in both hands. She looked at him directly, with the same steady, unhurried look he had been watching for 6 weeks, without ever understanding what it cost her, or what it was made of. Her hands did not move. He said, "I owe you an apology. I owe you a real one, and I intend to give it to you properly. But first I need to say it plainly, in front of the people who should have heard better from me a long time ago. The report against you was false. The man who filed it was using you to cover something he had done himself, and he is no longer employed by this company as of this afternoon. You have taken nothing from this building that you were not entitled to take, and I am ashamed that I allowed this to go as far as it went." He paused. He said, "What I saw last night is something I am going to have to live with for a while." She did not look away. She said, "I appreciate that, Mr. Hargrove." And then she said nothing more, because she was Clara Whitfield, and she never used 2 words where silence would do. From somewhere behind the shelving units, one of the younger night shift workers started clapping, and then several others joined, and then nearly everyone on the floor was clapping, and Mitchell walked out through the service exit on his own, without being asked, which was the only dignified thing he managed in the entire episode. He had the meeting with Helen Fay that evening, and a second meeting with the company's legal team the following morning, and a third with the head of employee welfare, who had held the position since Eleanor had created it, and who understood immediately what James was trying to do. The conversation with Clara herself happened on the Thursday, the day the HR meeting had originally been booked, which felt, to James, like the right kind of symmetry. He asked her to come to his office, not the ground floor room, and she came in her work clothes and sat in the chair across from his desk and waited without any visible anxiety, which made it easier. He told her about the fund. He told her what it would be called. He told her what it would do. He said, the James Whitfield Memorial Fund. For workers and their families. Emergency housing materials, shelter repairs, temporary accommodation. Your brother-in-law's name on something that will exist for a long time, in this company's name. He paused. I understand he died on a site that had connections to a company we were doing business with at the time. I'm having that looked at as well. I don't know yet what that will produce. But I want you to know it is being looked at. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands, in her lap. Then she looked up and said, the children are going to need a proper home. The house they're in now is condemned. He said, I know. That is also being looked at. We have a relationship with a housing trust. I have already made a call. She said, Mr. Hargrove, you don't have to, he said. I know I don't have to. I also know I should have asked, months ago, whether any of my people needed anything. Eleanor always knew. I stopped asking when she died. That's going to change. She was quiet again for a moment. She said, she sounds like she was a good woman. He said, she was the best person I knew. Clara said, she sounds like my sister. He said, yes. Yes, I think that might be right. The dinner happened 2 weeks later. Helen Fay organized it in the boardroom, which had never been used for a dinner before, and which turned out to be a much better room for a dinner than for a board meeting. Larger and quieter and, with the overhead lights off and the table laid properly, unexpectedly warm. James had asked Helen to bring whoever she thought should be there, and she had interpreted this broadly, which was the right interpretation. There were 22 people at the table. Webb was there. 3 members of the warehouse night shift were there, in their own clothes, which James noticed and was glad of. Clara was there, and beside her were the 3 children, and the youngest had fallen asleep against Clara's arm before the main course was finished, and nobody mentioned it or moved her. The oldest boy, his name was Thomas, ate with the methodical focus of a child who has not always been certain that there would be enough. At one point he looked up from his plate and found James watching him, and did not look away, just held the gaze with a frank, evaluating attention that reminded James of someone. He didn't know who at first. Then, he did. It reminded him of Clara. Near the end of the evening, someone lit a candle on the side table, a tall cream candle in a glass holder, the kind Eleanor had kept in the house. The windows were closed, and the room was still, and the flame stood perfectly upright without wavering. Then, for a moment, it moved. Not sideways, but up, a small, steady strengthening of the flame that had no physical explanation, and then it was still again. No one said anything about it. But James saw that Helen Fay had pressed her hand briefly to her own and was looking at the candle with an expression of quiet recognition, and across the table Clara had gone still, and then she smiled. The kind of smile that is also an exhale. That is also a letting go of something you have been holding for a very long time. James looked at the flame for a moment. Then, he looked at the room, at the table, at the people around it, at the children, at Thomas, who had gone back to his food, at the little girl asleep against her aunt's arm. He thought about what 30 years of being certain can cost you. He thought about the 31st floor and the glass, and the carefully managed distance between himself and the lives below. He thought about Eleanor, who had known better, who had always known better, and who had tried, in all the ways available to her, to teach him. He picked up his glass. He did not make a speech. He simply said, "Thank you," and the people at the table, without being told why, seemed to understand that he meant it in a way that went further back and further forward than this evening, that he meant it for more than one thing. There is a particular kind of person this world does not know how to account for. Not because they are rare, they are not rare, but because the systems built to measure worth were never designed with them in mind. The inventory sheets do not measure what Clara Whitfield carried out of that building every night. No camera recorded the weight of what she chose to do with her hands after a double shift, in a condemned house, in the dark, with nothing but some cardboard and some borrowed time. No quarterly audit would ever find it, because it was not a discrepancy. It was, in fact, the most precise balance sheet James Hargrove had ever encountered in 30 years of business. Every sacrifice accounted for. Every act of love producing exactly the return it was meant to produce, in the only currency that cannot be falsified, the sound of a child's voice saying, "You're home," and meaning it with their whole body, and having nowhere else in the world they would rather be. That is what dignity looks like when it has been doing its work for a long time, without an audience. And if you have ever been the person in that room, the one doing the quiet work, the one building the beds that no one sees, the one whose name does not appear on anything until someone finally pays attention, then you already know what Clara knew, that the work is not diminished by the not seeing, that it is in fact most itself in the dark.